So thank you all very much for having me here today. Talking about the US election campaign between Donald Trump on the Republican side and Hillary Clinton on the Democrat side brings to mind Henry Kissinger's quip about the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. Quote, "It's too bad they both can't lose." No, seriously, I mean, that is how many Americans feel about both major parties and their candidates. And seldom in modern history have the American people felt so disillusioned, disgusted with the establishment in Washington. You think about it. On November 8, Americans will elect someone who close to 2/3 of the country does not trust. Hillary Clinton, of course, is widely perceived to be untrustworthy, unpopular, and polarizing, probably the most untrustworthy, unpopular, and polarizing candidate in the modern era, but one, Donald Trump, whose divisive rhetoric, his crude and rude behavior, his erratic conduct, his lack of any governing philosophy or core governing philosophy is more than likely going to splinter the Republican Party, upset many minorities, especially Hispanics, aggravate independents in the centre who all too often swing elections, and moreover unite Democrats behind a flawed candidate in Hillary Clinton. That's what we so-called experts have been predicting over the last 6 to 12 months. And now is as good a time as any to acknowledge that we so-called experts have got Donald Trump wrong, and I'm one of them. Every time we've given this bloke the kiss of death, and there have been plenty of times throughout the primary process, and even more recently, it amounts to mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He revives and bounces back with tremendous force. It's truly astonishing. Now, with 8 weeks to go before the presidential election, will be this time 8 weeks exactly, because remember, it's Tuesday night in the United States, Wednesday afternoon our time. I think it's clear that the United States, and I'm a great admirer of the United States, but it is in a seriously bad way. And the American people are in a foul mood. A nation whose hallmark has been an irrepressible sense of optimism and purpose is seriously divided and uncertain on how to proceed. All the available public polling evidence show a clear trend. Large pluralities think their country is heading in the wrong direction, is in serious long-term decline, and their trust and faith in the institutions is at an all-time low. And I should stress, these trends that I've identified precede the Obama era. I'd go back to 2004, probably 2005 at the time of Hurricane Katrina, and when it was evident that the Iraq war became a disaster. That's when we saw a huge turnaround in the polling data indicating that Americans were profoundly unhappy. But we've had 2 elections since that period, and I would argue the spectre of decline haunts this election more than any other election in living memory. Many Americans, especially less affluent, white, working class folks, they feel it, they fear it. They've grown up knowing that the US is the most powerful, the most prosperous, culturally and economically the most influential nation in the world. And they are coming slowly and painfully to recognize that that is no longer true. In recent times, they've experienced wage stagnation, widening income inequality, and since the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, the most sluggish economic recovery since the Great Depression of the 1930s. If you compare the Obama recovery to the Clinton recovery of the 1990s or the Reagan recovery in the 1980s, it is chalk and cheese. These folks are angry and they want someone to blame. In short, many Americans say they are losing their country and desperate to take it back, Now, taking it back from whom is never clear, but the point here is they want someone through whom they can vent their fury at the Beltway ruling class and the journalists that make up what's known as the mainstream media. Policy details are not so important. They just want to send someone to Washington who will knock heads and get things done. Enter Trump. He presents himself as the living antidote to decline. You may have heard his constant mantra, let's make America great again. And that's the rationalisation for its receptivity to the Donald's Leap in the Dark campaign. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that what Trump has represented during the course of the last 12 months, these trends, in many respects, the same types of things are happening all across both Western and even Eastern Europe, Northern Europe and Southern Europe too. Indeed, I would argue Trump is the American version of those insurgent forces now dismantling established parties on the continent. From France and Finland, where far-right and anti-immigration parties are on the resurgence, to Poland and Hungary, where they have even won power, to Spain and Greece, where more left-wing Bernie Sanders-style socialist and economic nationalist movements are on the ascendancy. As my London Spectator colleague Freddie Gray has noted, in his willingness to tear down the party he hopes to lead, Trump is not all that different to Jeremy Corbyn, the British Labour leader. In his economic nationalism and anti-Islamism, Trump echoes Marine Le Pen of France. In his playing to the gallery, Trump resembles that Italian comic politician Beppe Grillo. And in his attacks on globalisation and trade deals, Trump reflects the views of socialist movements in Greece and Spain. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the reason why so many conservative or mainstream conservative Republicans are worried about this guy is because in many respects he represents a repudiation of much of what the Republican Party has stood for since Ronald Reagan's ascendancy in the late 1970s. Immigration, an activist engaged foreign policy, free trade and inclusive social conservatism. Trump is none of that. He's not an ideologue. He's an old-fashioned populist, as I say, in the mould of many of these European populists. How do we account for the rise of these folks? Well, I think the overarching development is a loss of faith in the traditional political elites and establishments and a search for radical alternatives. And behind that, there are several underlying trends. One, a backlash against economic insecurity spawned by globalisation, although many could argue it's modern technology. Two, a backlash against illegal immigration, porous borders, lax national borders and controls. Three, a genuine fear of not just Islamic terror, but conservative Muslims or those conservative Muslims who will not conform to Western cultural norms. And overriding a lot of that, of course, is the breakdown of the traditional media that, according to many of the populists and their supporters, is controlled by an untrustworthy elite. According to these folks, the mainstream media suppress debate and peddle political correctness. Meanwhile, a noisy, angry media environment allows many of these folks to sell kindergarten solutions to what I would call fantastically complicated problems. Hence, Donald Trump's proposal to ban Muslim immigrants and deport 11 million immigrants back to Mexico. Nothing better demonstrates this populist backlash in the United States against the Washington establishment and elite than foreign policy. As polls show, the American people are tired of the world. They're suffering from foreign policy fatigue. An April 2016 Pew Research poll showed that 57% of Americans agree that the United States should, quote, deal with its own problems and let others deal with theirs. The upshot is that Americans today appear less concerned about foreign policy than at any time since the heyday of isolationism between the two world wars, so the 1920s and the 1930s. In a polity that is acutely sensitive to public opinion, veritably driven by polls, focus groups, and of course that relentless 24/7 cycle. It's not even a 24/7 media cycle now with social media and the digital media. It's just around the clock. And this means that foreign policy is severely downgraded in the calculations of politicians. I note that in the 3 presidential debates in late September and early October, not one will be focused on foreign policy. Usually a presidential debate is about foreign policy, not this time. Again, enter Trump. During the past year, Trump, like the Democrat Bernie Sanders, has questioned the US penchant for promoting democracy. He's questioned subsidising allies' defence, and he's questioned the idea of military interventions, particularly in the Middle East, that he says all too often makes a bad situation worse. On Russia, yes, Trump is incapable of understatement when he praises and admires Vladimir Putin. Yet, nonetheless, a strong argument could be made, and it's one that I hold, that Trump is nevertheless raising legitimate questions about NATO 25 years since the threat, the overriding ideological and strategic threat posed by the Soviet Union, has disappeared. 24 out of the 28 member states of NATO are indeed freeloaders, as Trump says. Their governments spend well less than the 2% of GDP that is required. And NATO, notwithstanding victory over the Soviet communist regime 25 years ago, has sought to extend its security guarantees to an area that Moscow has long deemed as its sphere of influence well before Stalin and Lenin appeared on the scene. In making these arguments, Trump is railing against not just Hillary Clinton's liberal interventionism, not just the neoconservatism of the Republican Party since September 11, he's railing against the post-Cold War consensus in Washington, shared by Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives. If you go back to the late 80s and early 1990s, to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet communism, in an essay that made him famous among the elites, you may have heard of Francis Fukuyama. He declared that we were about to embrace the end of history, and by that he meant the end point of humankind's ideological evolution, the universalization of Western market liberal democracy. And he said that this would be the final form of human government. Meanwhile, and he was embraced. This was the prevailing wisdom. Some of us might laugh about it now, but this was the orthodoxy in the late 80s and early 90s. And meanwhile, Charles Krauthammer, one of the most distinguished Pulitzer Prize columnists, who's been writing a column for the Washington Post virtually every Friday for the last 30 years, an extraordinary run, in a wheelchair, in his early 60s, but still going strong. But in the early 1990s, he proclaimed that the US, quote, had a duty to lead a unipolar world, unashamedly laying down the rules of the world order and being prepared to enforce them. That was Krauthammer in 1990. And his advice fit neatly with Fukuyama's vision of the future. And as I said before, most Democrats, most Republicans, most liberals, most conservatives in Washington more or less agreed with the thrust of their theses 25 years ago. American global leadership, an American century, an indispensable nation, a Pax Americana, a benign hegemony. I mean, these were all the buzzwords of the US foreign policy establishment throughout the course of the last 25 years. But the rhetoric became more bellicose after 9/11, and this week, of course, marks the 15th anniversary since that terrible day. American outrage over those attacks, together with American exceptionalism and the habits of global hegemony since the previous decade, they gave US leaders a clear, overriding sense of mission and purpose that was lacking in the 1990s. So on the eve of the Iraq War, we had one prominent senior White House advisor boast, quote, "We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality." Or take the last 2 secretaries of state who epitomised a belief in the virtues of global American interventionism. In 2008, Condoleezza Rice declared, quote, "It's absolutely clear that America will be involved in nation building for years to come." In 2010, the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, said, "It's in America's DNA to believe there are no limits on what is possible or what can be achieved." Frankly, the results have been disastrous. The United States has been at war. We tend to forget this, but the United States has been at war for 22 out of 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union in Christmas 1991. 22 out of 25 years America's been at war, and there is no end in sight. NATO expansion in the 1990s under Bill Clinton and the 2000s under his successor, President George W. Bush, has merely antagonised Russia, pushing it closer to its old strategic rival, China, and hence undoing all the good work that Richard Nixon's détente did in the early 1970s. America's biggest gamble, the Iraq invasion, has led to what I call the mess in Batamia. As the recent Chilcot report makes clear, the scale of the disaster can be measured not only by its direct victims, obviously Americans and Brits, and mainly Iraqis. It must also be measured in the destruction of Iraq as the world has known it since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire a century ago. It's also led to the creation of, as you know, the Islamic State jihadists, who have become the most feared terror threat in the globe. Meanwhile, the United States has paid a profound price in blood, treasure, and diminished respect for political leaders. And as a result, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is bogged down in a crisis of confidence. American politics has become more polarising. What's more serious, as my friend Owen Harries, the former ABC Boyer lecturer and one of Australia's leading conservative intellectuals, makes clear time and again, what's more serious is the loss of respect and credibility that is evident, the diminished prestige and credibility and authority, and consequently a reduced ability to lead, persuade, and overawe. The point here is that, of course, the United States is the only nation that possesses the military means to defeat any other country, but there's not an American solution to every problem. In fact, there are a good many problems, such as Syria's civil war, now waging 5 years now, for which there may be no solution. As realists from George Kennan to Henry Kissinger, to my friend and mentor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, they've all too often argued Americans don't have the understanding of other societies and people, the attention span or staying power to engage in an activist, interventionist policy of nation building and democracy promotion on a large scale. And this is especially evident at a time when, as I mentioned earlier, clear segments of Americans, a majority of Americans, believe it is high time for the nation to concentrate on its own neglected internal problems. The defence budget has fallen and will continue to fall, and there is a strong aversion to seeing US soldiers killed and wounded. Now, to the extent that these attitudes prevail, they are inimical to the notion of US global leadership in the post-Cold War era. And this is a more refined way, I think, of saying what Trump is really all about when it comes to foreign policy. Now, I've painted a fairly pessimistic picture here, and I just want to make it clear that none of what I say should deny America's remarkable ability to bounce back from setbacks. Many of you have no doubt studied your American history time and again. The Civil War, the Great Depression in the 1930s, Vietnam in the 60s and early 70s, the Watergate scandal, even as recently as the late 1980s, when the prevailing wisdom was that Japan would surpass the United States as the greatest great power. And a bit like what was said about Menzies in John Howard's new documentary, which I was privileged to see the other day, what was said of Menzies, he's incredibly formidable on the rebound. Well, you could have said that, you could say that about the United States. Every time the critics give it the kiss of death, it's mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Remember too, the US has the world's strongest military. Its economy remains diverse and technologically advanced. I'd argue its higher education system, not necessarily its kindergarten to year 12, but its higher education is still the envy of the world. I think contrary to Trump, immigrants, and the data shows this, they're integrating as fast as previous generations. The shale gas revolution means that the United States is on the cusp of being not just energy independent, but more energy efficient. And demographic trends are working in America's favour, unlike in, say, Europe and China, where their populations are declining and ageing. The US, contrary to Trump, is not an economic wasteland, and it's not committing cultural suicide. But history has left American exceptionalism behind. The US won't enjoy the kind of global predominance that defined those decades in the post-war period. Of course, it will remain the most powerful state for the foreseeable future, but it's left the realm of necessity, and it's increasingly entering the realm of choice in international relations, where the key word is not and, but or, and the key question is not how, but why. And my conclusion tonight is that if Americans and their leaders don't recognise that reality, anger and anxiety will continue to characterise their politics for the foreseeable future. Thank you. It's a very good question. The founders set up the Constitution and the government to be, as you know, checks and balances. So you would have the executive branch or the White House and the administration versus the legislative branch or the Congress, both the House and the Senate, and of course the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court in this case. I think in foreign policy there's a disproportionate level of responsibility in favour of the executive. But on domestic issues, the president is all too often constrained by the legislature. And there is no question, and we saw it again this morning, Donald Trump came out with a campaign proposal on paid maternity leave. The Americans don't have that. This is a pretty progressive policy. Donald Trump is the trendsetter on this issue. And the Republicans are aghast. This is not their policy. So that's just one of many examples. So he might push, for example, paid maternity leave, but I would argue it's unlikely that those so-called Tea Partiers who believe in slashing the size of the government would embrace Trump's domestic agenda. I think there'd be a lot of backlash from his own party, although intriguingly, he might get some support from Democrats on an initiative like that. Again, I reiterate my point. Trump is not a conventional Republican. I'm not saying he's a Democrat either, but on some issues, he could see some overlap with the Democrats more than he would his own party. And that's precisely why all the prominent conservative and free market and neoconservative think tanks in Washington, well, they're staying away from sharp objects. That's a great question. And many libertarians in the United States, most notably the Cato Institute, make the argument that by slashing the defence budget, you're going to save a lot of tax dollars that'll go towards paying the deficit and debt. But the problem with Trump is, and I probably didn't do justice to a more complicated version of Trump, he's strikingly ignorant about the world, he's erratic, and he shoots from the hip. Now, that's a deadly combination. The other thing I'd say is that he's very inconsistent. Now, I think broadly, if he were here right now, he'd agree with the broad thrust of what I said. But the other day, I noticed that Trump said he wants to increase defence spending. So he's a bit all over the place. But this is in keeping with many of his positions over the last few years. It's amazing. Someone who vacillates and equivocates and oscillates, it doesn't get punished. These flip-flops don't seem to hurt him. His core supporters will stick with him. So there is a bit of inconsistency there, which goes against my broader thesis this evening. But I think that all things considered, he's more likely to retrench America's role in the world, or at least discriminate. And to the extent that he does that, that will clearly mean that defence budget should and will come down. He'll probably get support among Democrats and some Tea Party Republicans, but those neoconservative Republicans won't have a bar of it. They will fight tooth and nail for defence contracts. not least because many of those special interests help pay for their campaigns. Yeah. Look, I think we're in uncharted territory. It's a great question, and I don't have a very good answer because we've never had a presidential candidate. I mean, you mentioned Barry Goldwater, and Barry Goldwater, for those who aren't familiar, was the Republican candidate in 1964. He was the first, if you like, conservative Republican candidate. He was a pre-Reagan figure, and he ran against Lyndon Johnson in the 64 election, and he got smashed in a landslide. I think Goldwater won 6 states, if that. But I think Goldwater was nevertheless a political grown-up. I mean, he was in the Senate. He'd been part of compromising with Democrats on a wide range of issues. Towards the end, in the 80s, when he left the Senate, he became something of an elder statesman. But I think Trump is just a different category altogether. He's probably more like Huey Long, the populist Democrat governor of Louisiana, I think in the 1930s. But of course, he was assassinated, so we never know what he would have done if he got to the White House. Trump, I just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of publications that highlight his experience in business, and the consensus is that this shows disturbing patterns in the way he conducts himself. He's erratic, shoots from the hip, doesn't read. And what's even more disturbing than that, I think, is the fact he hasn't surrounded himself with smart, sharp thinkers. You know, when you're the president of the United States, you have to have good people around you. He doesn't. He just doesn't. And that's what's really disturbing. Now, it's conceivable and hopeful that if he did win, and I don't think he will win, by the way, but if he did win, the Republican Party would try to make sure that there were some political grown-ups in the White House who would try to sober him up before he did anything rash and imprudent. But that's my best response because we are in uncharted territory. Well, Maureen Dowd from the New York Times, one of the most prominent columnists at the Times and a staunch critic of Hillary, said that the problem here isn't Hillary's health, it's Hillary's stealth. And I think that's the key issue here. I mean, look, these candidates, they run pretty tough schedules, morning, noon and night. And she's been doing it now for more than 18 months. It's a very hectic program. And I'm 44, I'm reasonably fit. I would struggle doing all of that. So it makes sense that these candidates get sick. They all get sick. She's just, unfortunately, got caught on television. And that looked terrible, not television, but on these digital cameras. And it was a terrible look. And I think if she has another episode like that in public, then questions really will be raised. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Democrats start panicking and think about replacing her as the candidate. That is conceivable, if it happens. But I think the bigger issue in this controversy is the deception, or at least the lack of transparency on the part of the Clinton campaign. She was diagnosed with pneumonia on Friday. We only found out about this because she had this episode, and they came out with it 2-3 days later. Shortly after that very incident where she collapsed, she was missing for 90 minutes, and usually journalists are always around the candidates. The campaign never alerted to the journalists to where she was, what she was doing. They, again, reaffirmed these widespread doubts that Hillary and her team are untrustworthy. So I think that's the bigger issue here. Now, it is true that towards the end of her time as Secretary of State in the winter of 12-13, our summer, she did faint. She had a concussion and was subsequently proven she had some blood clots near her brain. That's a genuine concern. But again, I think all of this is a reminder that she and Trump should release medical records. I mean, when John McCain ran for the White House in 2008, he had a melanoma and he produced 1,200 pages of medical records. Fancy that, 1,200 pages. I don't think they have to do that, but they should be more transparent about how their health is. The other point I'd say is that Hillary next month turns 69. Now, she'll be the oldest Democratic presidential candidate in history. It's extraordinary. Trump is 70. If he wins the presidency, he will be the oldest president on Inauguration Day, even older than Ronald Reagan. So I think it's more incumbent on these candidates to be more frank and transparent with the electorate about their own health. And I think what I've just said is pretty much the conventional wisdom in Washington, and I think they'll both start giving out their health records very soon. Well, look, I don't think NATO should be dissolved. I think abrupt discontinuities can create more problems than resolve them. And my point is that, as John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt have said, America probably should be more, instead of a balancer of first resort, be a balancer of last resort. So its goal should be to ensure that the Western Hemisphere, America's sphere of influence, is always secure, and to ensure that no potential hegemon disturbs the status quo in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Now, look, this is a contrarian view. I had a big argument, but I've had a the other night we had dinner. Tony Abbott and I had a big disagreement. We're good mates, but we have fierce disagreements about this very question about Russia. As you may recall, when he was Prime Minister in 2014, he said that he was shirt front Mr. Putin on the eve of the G20 summit. And to be fair to Tony, I think he represents the prevailing wisdom in both Washington and Brussels that Putin represents a very serious threat to European order. In fact, people from Hillary Clinton to Prince Charles have said he's the new Hitler. And I think this is just hyperbole. I mean, I think for what it's worth, Putin's behavior in Ukraine has been, all things considered, defensive and reactive to, I would argue, misguided Western strategy of first NATO expansion in the 90s and 2000s, which I would argue betrayed the implicit agreements reached between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev in the mid-1990s, that in exchange for a reunified Germany, NATO would not go east. Clinton just completely waved that aside. And in a moment of American hubris, Fukuyama, Krauthammer, this mindset prevailed that NATO should be expanded to Eastern Europe and even the Baltics. So the Russians have a case there that this was unnecessarily provoking them in the West's moment of victory. They defied Winston Churchill's wise principle, in victory magnanimity. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that coup that took place in February 2014, which the Americans and the Brussels and NATO were part of. They helped bring down a democratically elected pro-Russian government in Kiev, and that's when Putin reacted. He reacted by going into Crimea. He may have been wrong to have done it. I'm not saying he was right or wrong. I'm just simply saying that's what motivated him, and he had broad support from the Russian people. So I think, again, Trump, for all his flaws, and I'm not a Trump supporter, he recognizes that he can do a détente with Putin's Russia. And from an American perspective, I'd say yes, because Russia doesn't pose any serious threat to the United States, unlike, say, potentially China. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first point to bear in mind is we don't know precisely how a President Trump would govern. We just don't. He's just so erratic and he's just all over the place. But if he were true to his word, it would be a disturbing development insofar as that he would impose a 45% tariff on Chinese goods. Now, apart from anything else, that would increase the price of consumer goods for those very folks he's ostensibly trying to help. The battlers in America, the white working class, would all of a sudden have to pay higher prices for their textiles, clothing and footwear. But the broader point would be that it would spark a trade war with China. And anyone who's studied economic history knows that trade wars are more than likely going to precipitate global economic downturns. We are China's largest trading partner. We have been for the best part of a decade. Our most important security ally, of course, is the United States. It has been for the last 65 years. It still is, and it will be for the foreseeable future. So we're in this delicate position where, and I think, frankly, both sides of politics, both Labor and the coalition, Howard, Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, they've done a pretty good job of riding these two horses simultaneously. It's a very delicate diplomatic balancing act. So it's in our interest to see that Washington and Beijing have a very cooperative relationship. But if he upsets them with a trade war, then there'll be huge economic consequences. And if he pushes the question of freedom of navigation patrols through the Chinese 12 nautical mile zone in the South China Sea, which I don't think he'd be so bullish about for the reasons I explained, and if he doesn't have support from other Asian states, that could be a problem as well. I just think that on security issues, he'd be more likely to be a bit non-interventionist. But on economic issues, that would have a huge impact on Australia and the Asian economy. And it's in our interest to see a thriving, open economy throughout the Asia Pacific. Very good question. On Hillary, as we've noticed throughout the last 12 months, she faced a very hard competitor in Bernie Sanders, a 74-year-old socialist who'd never really identified himself as a Democrat until relatively recently. And Sanders ran an outstanding campaign. And in some respects, by the way, Sanders and Trump on some issues are not all that different. That's interesting to note. On trade, for example, on foreign policy, Sanders would have agreed with much of my analysis. And so because Sanders did so well, Hillary was caught wrong-footed and she had to move left politically in order to wrap up the nomination. And on one of those keynote issues was the question of trade. When she was Secretary of State, as many of you probably know, she was an unashamed supporter of what's known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that 12-nation Asia-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. That's an essential part of President Obama's pivot to Asia. And in fact, in Australia, I think in 2012, she said that the TPP was the gold standard for trade deals. Well, during the course of the campaign, she ran a million miles away from that position, largely because she wanted to neuter Sanders' very effective campaign that trade deals were hurting the working class Americans, costing manufacturing jobs, among other things. So she shifted left to win the nomination. But intriguingly, she sees an opportunity here to reach out to many conservative Republicans who won't stomach Trump. So, you know, she's got that. She's winning over the left of the Democratic Party, but many of these conservatives who don't like Trump, who believe in an activist, engaged Pax Americana, they're going to support her. So she's caught in a bit of a bind. If she's in office, she has a difficult task of juggling these two extremes. On foreign policy, I think that Hillary represents the more activist, internationalist tradition of Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Scoop Jackson, Joe Lieberman, Madeleine Albright. She believes in the idea of the indispensable nation and that America has a moral duty to be the world policeman. She subscribes fully to that Fukuyama, Krauthammer worldview that I identified. And some might argue she might be the last representative of that worldview. You know, we never know. On your second question, which is an outstandingly good question, and I have to say that'll be the big issue for many scholars of American politics throughout the foreseeable future. What do those Trump supporters do? What happens to the Republican Party if Trump loses? Will normal programming take place and the party reverts to its Reagan, Gingrich, Mitt Romney establishment ways? I doubt it. I think the Republican Party is on the cusp of a civil war. And ironically, the person who can ensure that that civil war doesn't take place is one Donald J. Trump. Because if he's a winner, he's a grinner. And the party will rally around him. But if he loses, as most people, as the conventional wisdom says he'll lose, then we could be in the stages of splintering of the party of Reagan, Eisenhower, and Lincoln. That's a serious possibility. Well, again, the prevailing wisdom, and I hope you don't think that I'm just a mouthpiece for the orthodoxy, because I try to challenge it tonight in my remarks about Trump and foreign policy, but the prevailing wisdom to which I subscribe is that demography is working to the Democrats' advantage, because a lot of these minority groups, particularly Hispanics, they're a fast-growing minority group. They would be 15 going on 16% of the national population. African Americans remain at about 12%, and then there's Asian Americans who are about 6-7%. So as that minority vote continues to rise, the white share of the national vote will continue to decline. And if the Republican Party, again, says the conventional wisdom, doesn't make efforts to reach out to Hispanics especially, then they're going to get smashed, and they may even lose solid red states like Texas, which has a huge fast-growing Hispanic population. So demography is working against the Republican Party, and this is one of the reasons why everyone seems to think that Trump is going to lose, because he's alienated so many minorities. But intriguingly, I saw a poll this morning in Nevada. Nevada has a Hispanic population of about 12-13%, and it's a battleground state. But the poll this morning showed that Trump is up 10 points among Hispanics. So I'm not sure what to make of that. The other point I'd make is that, you mentioned that voting is voluntary in the United States. In 2012, 5 million mainly white, working class, blue collar workers did not vote. And they're eligible to vote. They're on the rolls, but they just do not show up on election day. Why? Because they didn't like Obama, and they didn't like Mitt Romney because he was seen as representative of Wall Street and corporate America. And these were folks who have been displaced by globalization, technology, and trade deals. So who's their candidate this year? Donald Trump. He talks their language. He's one of them. He's railing against the establishment. He's railing against globalization. He's railing against fighting wars that America can't win in the Middle East. He's talking their language. He's very much anti-PC. These guys probably were old Democrats, but they hate both sides of politics. Now, he can get out those 5 million white working class folks to election day. Remember, in America, it's all about turnout. Very important, unlike here where it's compulsory. That's why he might have a decent chance of winning. And remember, Hillary is overwhelmingly unpopular. So if he can find a way, if Trump can find a way of getting out these white working class folks in enough of those battleground states to turn out on the day and find a way of suppressing the minority vote and the youth vote, who are very apathetic voting, that's a good thing for Donald and a bad thing for Hillary. But again, the prevailing wisdom is that demography and the electoral arithmetic are against him. Yeah. Well, in this campaign, there are two main third-party candidates or independent candidates. One lady, Gloria Steinem from the Greens. She's probably got about 2-3% of the vote. They're probably coming away. A lot of them are probably Bernie Sanders type, left-wing socialist, very much climate enthusiastic type voters. And then the other candidate is a libertarian candidate. He's a former governor of New Mexico, but he only has about 9, 10, maybe 11%. And the reason why we don't hear much about these guys is because they need to get 15% of the vote before they get on the platform to debate the two major candidates. And it seems unlikely that either of those candidates will get the 15% poll number to justify getting time on prime time. No, I don't think so. No, she's an unpopular lady, but I think they'll wait before she gets to the White House first. Look, I have to say, Hillary Clinton, there's a wide, she attracts a great deal of loathing. As I said before, she's the most unpopular, polarizing figure in American presidential history, other than Donald Trump. But look, on the other hand, to be fair to her, she's a highly intelligent lady. She's a lawyer, very successful lawyer in her own right. She's a prominent writer. She holds her own in a debate. She's on top of detail. She's got a wealth of experience. I would argue she's probably the most experienced presidential candidate in living memory. Perhaps you'd have to go back to 88 with George H.W. Bush, former CIA director, former congressman, former ambassador to the United Nations, former US representative to the People's Republic of China, and of course a former vice president. But she's got a wealth of experience, high profile first lady in her husband's White House. She was a senator in New York for 8 years, and of course she was a Secretary of State. But this is the year of the outsider, and she represents the status quo, and she's the queen of the liberal establishment, and it's not a good time to be in that position. The amazing thing about this election is that the Democrat candidate should be streets ahead of Donald Trump, and she's not. And those poll numbers continue to narrow, so we may have a very exciting race. I think that Donald Trump will win. Will lose. I think Clinton will. Clinton will win, but I have to say, I've been critical of Trump, and I've never attracted so much vicious email, except I've done this show called Q&A, and many of you have probably heard Q&A on the ABC, and I've been very sceptical of the carbon tax when Julie Gillard was Prime Minister, and I got a lot of hate mail then. But the hate mail I get from Trump supporters is quite extraordinary. And I take them seriously because a lot of these folks, and they're in Australia, they're also in America, but they track you down on the internet. They have had a gut full of political correctness in Washington. They don't like globalization. They don't like the idea that America should be fighting these unwinnable wars. And they don't think America's got a dog in the fight between the Shia militia and the Sunni jihadists. You know, these guys are passionate. And that's why a lot of these folks should not be dismissed. They represent a significant segment of middle America. And if they turn out to vote, those white working class folks I mentioned before, and Hillary's folks stayed home, then we could have a very exciting night in 8 weeks' time. Thanks so much. Lovely.